Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a celebration of Black women as community leaders and advocates, co-hosted by Holy Blossom's Women Advocacy Group and the Anti-Racism Group, and in honor of Black History Month. My name is Ruby Knaffo, and I'm a member of Holy Blossom Temple and co-chair of the Anti-Racism Group. And I have the great honor of presenting our panelists for the evening, who are three impressive women leaders and advocates in the Black community: Dr. Jill Andrew, Charlene Theodore, and Tema Smith. Dr. Jill Andrew is the MPP for Toronto St. Paul's. First elected in 2018, Jill serves as the Ontario NDP critic for heritage and culture and women's issues. Jill is also a member of the Ontario NDP Black Caucus, a first of its kind in the Ontario legislative history. Outside of politics, Jill is the co-founder of Body Confidence Canada and is an award-winning educator and former columnist, equity and body image advocate, speaker, and writer. Charlene Theodore is president of the Ontario Bar Association, the OBA, and a workplace lawyer with a background in public policy and government relations, and currently serves as in-house counsel to one of Ontario's largest teacher associations. One of Canadian Lawyers' top 25 most influential lawyers of 2020, she's known for tackling some of the most challenging issues facing the bar and the justice system, as well as bringing about positive change throughout the profession for women and people of color. As the OBA's first Black president, Ms. Theodore has embraced her role in improving equality, diversity, and inclusion in the justice sector and beyond. Her groundbreaking initiative, Not Another Decade, is focused on moving the dial on equality for Black and Indigenous people and people of color. Tema Smith is a diversity advocate, writer, and Jewish community builder. She's currently Director of Professional Development at 18 Doors, formerly Interfaith Family. And this comes after 7 years as a synagogue professional, most recently as the Director of Community Engagement at Holy Blossom Temple. Tema is also a contributing columnist at The Forward, whose writing has been published in My Jewish Learning, The Globe and Mail, and the Canadian Jewish News. Tema is dedicated to building a meaningful and inclusive Jewish community through research, training, writing, and relational engagement work. And over the past 10 years, Tema has worked to advance the conversation on racially diverse Judaism, working with organizations like Beshul Lashon, I hope I said that correctly, and the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and the Miles Nadal JCC, as CJPAC, and conducting trainings and presentations for numerous synagogues and Jewish organizations, including Holy Blossom. So it's wonderful to have you all here. Thank you so much for joining us. And the discussion this evening will be moderated by Megan Stevens. Megan Stevens is the acting executive director and general counsel at the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, also known as LEAF. And she is returning to full-time legal practice to continue to advocate for the rights of women and gender diverse people through criminal and constitutional litigation. She and her family are members of Holy Blossom. And with that, I will pass the mic to Megan, and looking forward to the conversation this evening. So thank you all so much for being here, whether you're tuning in on Zoom or Facebook, and have a great night.
Thank you. I am muted in a classic 2020 and 2021 fashion. That's how I'm going to start things off tonight. I apologize. But I really want to start by thanking Ruby for the lovely introduction of our amazing panelists, and thanking all of our panelists for being here. I've had the opportunity to get to know these amazing women over the course of the last couple of years in various different ways. And I know we're all really in for a treat tonight to hear about their experiences as leaders in our community. So it's also a real privilege for me to get to moderate this discussion, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about their journeys to where they currently are, and the work that continues and needs to continue to address anti-Black racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I want to start off, you're all really here to hear from the panelists. So Jill, Charlene, and Tema, all three of you have really managed to break through significant barriers, earning leadership positions and making space for yourselves in places where Black or mixed race women have not always been welcome. I'm wondering if you can start off by having, I'd love each of you to tell us a bit about the personal journeys that brought you to your current roles. And I wanted to start off with Jill. Jill, as we know, when you were elected in 2018 to the Toronto St. Paul's riding for the NDP, it's pretty remarkable that you were the first Black and queer person in Canada to be elected to office. I'm wondering if you can tell us what inspired you to seek public office and a little bit about how you got to where you're at.
Well, thank you very much, Megan, and hello to all of the audience members from Holy Blossom and from community that are joining this evening. I'd first like to start by acknowledging the start of Purim, that's tomorrow. And I just want to say, you know, I hope it's an opportunity to hold each other as near as possible, considering the challenging times that we're facing and the difficulty, quite frankly, that we do have, in fact, with being as near to our loved ones as possible. So I'm just sending love and light to all of your families and just emphasizing our commitment to social justice, you know, in all of its forms. So I just want to mention as well that I am the first queer Black person to sit in the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. Luckily, not the first Black one to sit in the legislature, but nonetheless, it's quite an honor. It was quite an honor in 2018. St. Paul's, you know, put me here. Our community, those who supported, those who volunteered, those who donated, that's the reason why I'm in the legislature. So, you know, when we talk about arriving, you know, I think that I'm still a work in progress, as I believe we should all know that we're still works in progress. And I'm sitting in that seat at Queen's Park because of Toronto St. Paul's and because of our outstanding team. You know, in terms of what got me, you know, into politics or the journey I've had, I have been a lifelong learner, someone who thrived at education, loved education, enjoyed going to school, enjoyed being challenging to my teachers and professors sometimes. I was always that kid who asked, really, well, what about this? You know, so education runs in my blood. And, you know, having been not only a student, but having been a teacher, you know, a contract lecturer, you know, a child and youth worker, an equity advisor, I really had a front row, you know, to the good, the bad, and the indifferent, you know. And while I saw the outstanding work happening, you know, in our schools, particularly in the Toronto District School Board, where I was closely affiliated, you know, I also saw the disparities, you know, the inequities. I also saw, you know, anti-Black racism, you know, and homophobia and transphobia and anti-Semitism, you know, rearing its ugly head, you know, and I knew that, you know, having an opportunity to try to mend that, you know, being part of the conversation, having a seat at the table was crucial to making the kinds of change for the better that I knew we needed, you know, ensuring that we have properly funded education, for goodness sakes, you know, would be a great start. You know, outside of education, I also had a very interesting health story of my own, you know, having lived with certain chronic health issues. I've got lots of experience of being hospitalized, you know, and luckily surviving surgeries, you know, and for the most part, you know, you receive excellent care. You know, we're very lucky here in Toronto, here in Ontario, here in Canada. But again, inequities and barriers can show themselves, you know, and I had to fight and advocate for myself in the healthcare system, particularly back in 2016, especially. So a long story short, you know, how did I get in? You know, what got me to politics? You know, as a woman, as a Black woman, as a queer woman, I was asked. And I was asked and asked and asked many times. And that's often the case for women, certainly, you know, but my lived experience, you know, also drew the roadmap. And sitting now, as a politician, where I see the power dynamics and the opportunities for us to really do with, not for, but with, working side by side with our communities, things that can make our lives better. It's crucial. It's crucial that we get involved. So here I am, giving it my best. Thank you.
That's wonderful, Jill. I think probably I would hazard a guess that all of us just in the panelist screen are also people who are lifelong learners, and those who are joining us tonight are also people who are hoping to continue to learn. So I really appreciate that. But I also love hearing that you were asked, and I think that's really important, and it's a reminder to all of us to think about asking people too.
Yes.
Inviting people into spaces that they might not otherwise think about going. Charlene, I want to ask you as well. You have really shattered barriers, and you've been a really great leading light within the legal profession, but most recently as the first Black woman to be president of the Ontario Bar Association. Can you tell us about the path that brought you to where you are today?
Certainly. And just to start, just thank you everyone for having me. I've been so excited to participate in this discussion tonight. My personal path, I was drawn to law because at quite a young age, I understood the duality as a Black woman of law being used as a tool of oppression for Black people and women of all races. But I also very quickly understood the other side of the coin is that, lawyers have been behind or at the foundation of every major advancement that we've had toward what we are continually striving for, which is an ideal Canadian democracy. And so, I saw that two sides of it. It's a mechanism for driving for progress and combating injustice. And I really saw it as a career that appealed to both my idealism and ambition. But I always knew, I think, that my work as a lawyer, and I don't know if this is innate or if it comes from being raised as a Black woman with our distinct cultural sense of community, which I think we also share that trait with the Jewish community as well. I always knew that my work as a lawyer would be more powerful and a better agent of change if I joined forces with similarly active and engaged lawyers. So I've always been involved in student groups. And as I made the transition to practice, I knew how important it was to find, myself with like-minded and maybe not so like-minded visionaries and legal change makers. So I became active in the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers and the OBA. My activity in the OBA kind of worked out well for me. I am the first Black president of any gender to lead the association since 1907. And that has more of an impact when you consider that the president of the OBA has 1-year terms. And I am only the 10th woman to lead the OBA. And so, I was really honored to be, I could not have imagined what was on my doorstep when I took office at the OBA last September. I was beyond my presidency. I work as in-house legal counsel for one of the province's largest teachers associations, and so we had just come off of the largest strike in a generation, and probably the most adversarial relationship that we've had with government about foundationally what education needs and means to our province and to our country. And then there was a global reckoning on inequality in general and anti-Black racism specifically, and a pandemic. And so, I think I took my helm, not just being the first, but there were all these added layers onto it. And, I felt once I once I realized everything was happening and I couldn't defer anything and run away and hide, I really saw it as an opportunity, and an awesome responsibility that I just wanted to spend the term making sure I didn't take for granted. All of these things combined, maybe not for a reason. We all wish that they wouldn't have had all of these specific, huge factors combining at the same time, but they did, and they combined with my arrival. And so I just looked at it for, out of the chaos, the opportunity that there was to make a real impact and make what I think is needed is real lasting change. This isn't new work that I'm doing, but I feel like the benefit of these very, very dire, unfortunate circumstances that we're in is that the message is resonating more with people. And the OBA really is committed to moving the dial demonstrably in advancing equality and diversity and inclusion in the legal profession and across the justice sector. And, I think what I'm really about is transforming good intentions into concrete action. And that's how I got here and really what shaped my work for my term.
That's so incredibly powerful and so amazing to hear about that. And it is also crazy, all of those things happening at once.
It's like winning a weird sort of lottery.
Yeah. See, I love the glasses half full attitude that you bring to this, Charlene, and you always do. But I love that, the idea of out of the chaos, finding an opportunity to make an impact. And I think since I've known you, I've seen that can do, and let's just head down and work on this attitude. And I think that's amazing. And the idea of transforming those good intentions into concrete actions is, I think, something all of us need to be thinking about. So so thank you for sharing the positivity that can come out of this chaos. And then that will bring us to Tema. So Tema, you are a very familiar face to many people at the Holy Blossom, in the Holy Blossom community, and you're known as a trailblazer in the Jewish community more broadly for the work that you have done to help Jewish organizations explore systemic barriers that exist for racially and ethnically diverse Jews. So can you tell us how you came to work in this space, how you landed where you have landed right now?
Sure. So first of all, if anyone hears any like insane dog noises, my puppy, or sees like a Muppet just appearing and disappearing, he was trying to dig a hole in the couch. I had to get him. Anyhow, so it's so nice to be here with all of you, and it's nice to be with my home synagogue. As we're coming to the end of Black History Month, it just feels really meaningful for me that this is my last Black History Month event. How did I get here? Probably a lot of you actually don't know my whole story. I grew up in Toronto. My mother, who is, I know, in the audience today, is an Ashkenazi Jew. She grew up in like at Avenue and Eglinton area, and Polish descent mother, Russian, Ukrainian, like that part of the world descent father. And what a lot of people might not know about me is that my father is actually Black. His family comes from the Bahamas. They moved to New York a few years before he was born. And my father was born and raised in New York City as a Black man. And if you know New York, he was raised on Staten Island, which is a very, not a place where you expect Black families, especially not in the 50s, to have settled. They ended up there in large part because they were involved in the Catholic worker movement, and there was a Catholic worker farm there. And so they ended up there for basically those reasons. And my dad grew up dealing all the time, I'm going to try putting him down and hope for the best, with the very real realities of anti-Black racism in the US. My parents met in New York for a whole bunch of reasons, moved back to Toronto, and a few years later, I came along, and a couple years after that, my brother did. We were an interfaith, interracial family in a Jewish community that, for lack of a better word, was very small c conservative. There were not families like ours. This is the 80s. There were not really families that looked like ours. And I was, though, extremely curious about what's Jewish community? What does Jewish community look like? What's a synagogue? Why don't we go to one? My mother still teases me and says she doesn't know where this came from because she didn't grow up going to synagogue, really. And she's like, I mean, you've wanted to know forever, so it's not really a surprise you became a Jewish professional. But, you know, was just very, very curious. I was very close to my grandparents growing up. And, you know, we had a very culturally Jewish home. At the same time, we had a home where we were taught that about our Black heritage and about being mixed. And it was always sort of integrated into one identity. So, you know, I ran a training session this afternoon in my day job, which is, I'll get to exactly what I do when I get to that part. And, you know, one of the things we say is never say to somebody that they're half Jewish. And I say, I mean, but if somebody's going to tell you that they are, just understand that what they might mean is exactly how I phrased it, which was like, you know, one half of my parents was Jewish and one half of my parents was Black. So I used to say I was half Black, half Jewish, recognizing all the time that that was actually one integrated whole in me. I was always 100% both of those things. I grew up actually around many more mixed race kids and Black kids than I did around Jewish kids. I grew up downtown, going to public school, you know, went to Ord Street and Jesse Ketchum, and eventually to Jarvis Collegiate, and really had very little involvement outside of my family in Jewish life. Went away to university. Long story short, ended up doing a grad school year in Israel. And in Israel, I met just all of these people from very different Jewish communities than the one that I had been semi-exposed to, who were really sort of socially engaged future leaders of Jewish community. It's been very fun sort of looking out on the landscape of sort of the young Jewish leadership, young being, you know, late 30s into early 40s now, sort of rising to that level of Jewish leadership and seeing all of my classmates from my year in Israel. And these were people who first of all, didn't think it was strange that I had a Black father, which most of the Jews I had encountered previously did. Had a lot of questions. And second of all, were people who were very deeply committed to issues of racial justice, which again was something that I had not really encountered much of in my childhood. I came back and I was like, okay, where are these Jews? Where are these Jews? Sorry if you hear that, they are going insane. You know, where are these people? And I looked and I did not find. I kind of ran out of money in grad school and ended up getting a job in the Jewish community because I knew that's where I wanted to be. I didn't know how, I didn't know why, but I just kind of knew that what I wanted to do with my life was create Jewish community spaces for the people like me who were looking for them but might not have seen themselves. Okay, hold on one second. It's this little troublemaker. I say after dark is like puppy witching hour, and it doesn't help that I've been on Zoom all day, so I haven't really been able to entertain him. Anyhow, so I spent about 8 years working in synagogues, you know, doing a whole bunch of different kinds of work, some of which was around making sure that interfaith families specifically felt welcome, but also at the same time getting involved more and more with asking questions about racially diverse Jews. And my particular interest, of course, is Black Jews, whether mixed race or not, and asking questions around how do we create the community that recognizes the existence of Black Jews and also prepares us for leadership roles. I will say, I 100% think some of the ability I was able to sort of slide right into a Jewish professional role is because I don't look different than your average sort of white Ashkenazi Jew. And I've always sort of occupied this in between space of, on the one hand, I can walk into a room totally unnoticed. On the other hand, I always feel slightly out of place. And again, that half and half, 100, 100, like that is always sort of part of my frame. I was really lucky to be asked to do some research for the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, asking questions of Jews of color who either were in rabbinical school considering it or recently finished. And that kind of set me on a path to really want to bring that work into my life more sort of formally. Long story short, a couple of years ago, this opportunity to move into my current role kind of dropped in my lap. I am now the Director of Professional Development at an organization called 18 Doors. And what we do is we work with Jewish organizations to make them more inclusive of interfaith families. So I do our training, I do all of our coaching and consulting and all of that sort of stuff. I run webinars, create resources for Jewish organizations. And while that work is sort of broadly about interfaith families where one parent is Jewish and one parent is something else, of course, that work intersects as well with the work on race. One last thing that I'll say is, ever since George Floyd's murder, the Jewish community has like woken up to this issue of race, both in the sense of racial justice work that I call sort of the outward facing stuff, and also really woken up to the fact that, like, we've been saying for a lot of time that this is something we care about, but maybe we haven't been moving fast enough internally for Jews of color. And I've had the great fortune of getting to speak all over North America at this point to Jewish communal groups, whether it's about building leadership pipelines or whether it's about making sure that your materials reflect your community, or what to do with your materials if you don't have people in your community who are there to be reflected in materials, but you want to signal that you would love to, and all of that sort of work, as well as speaking to the public about my own story, how I arrived at Jewish communal work, and the stories that are shared with me by many other Jews of color, and in particular Black Jews. And it's just such an honor to be able to do this really sort of deep work inside the community I had been looking for. It's been just such a profound honor for me to be able to do it. And, I'll say for me is sharing a panel with Jill and with Charlene during Black History Month is just kind of like, oh yeah, like I am doing this work in like a context, like, because I'm always in sort of Jewish space, that I kind of forget that Jewish space is part of broader space. So it's been very exciting to be here tonight. And that's really all I have to say.
That is, that's also an amazing story about your journey to the really, really important work that you are doing within the Jewish community, and really helping to focus these important conversations that I think, as you point out, are long overdue, about how we can create communities that can recognize racially diverse Jews, the existence of that there are Black Jews, that there are, racialized Jews of all types, and how important that is. And I think your point about how the killing of George Floyd last summer has helped the Jewish community kind of focus their minds on these issues, focus particularly both outwardly and inwardly about anti-Black racism, is kind of a nice segue to the next set of questions that I want to ask all of you about, which really was, I do think that was in a way a moment that for many, I think in the Black community, it wasn't a moment of awakening. It was just more of anti-Black racism that they had seen over and over. But there was something about that moment that spoke to people who didn't have that same lived experience. And so I did want to ask all of you about the work. You all do amazing and important work shining a light on these problems in different ways and pushing for real change. And I wanted to start off by asking each of you to tell us, what does anti-Black racism look like for you? So
I
I'm
can
not sure who
start.
wants to go first.
I can start.
Okay.
You know, for me, so context, it's pervasive and enduring and all the time. And I think one of the things I can say, having that lived experience, I think many Black people are even now waking up to, you know, water doesn't feel wet when you're drowning. Right, so there are things that we've been talking about, um uh that have been, you know, we've been talking about and learning about since we were children, and it's just now that you all guys have joined the conversation since the murder of George Floyd. But because we've been born into this and ingrained with this, I know personally I've even through this process been saying, okay, well, this isn't right either, and recognizing instances. And for me at you know, when this is the work I do, and so I say that in the context that, you know, I'm going to talk specifically about workplaces because that's my passion, that's my knowledge area, and I think that that is really the key to diversity and representation in this society and in others. Right, when there is equal access for people to make a living for themselves and do their best work. So you know, in the work. I accidentally hit the space key. I thought I could get through this without accidentally muting myself. So, um, my focus this year, aside from the broader work that we're going to be doing over the next 10 years at the OBA, my focus this year is on real, substantive, and measurable equality in workplaces and shifting from performative allyship and, you know, knowing that there are working with people that are, again, well-meaning, have devoted a lot of time and energy and resources to diversity at work, but aren't seeing the results. And so I think in the workplace, when you talk about anti-Black racism, a lot of people think that it looks like, you know, outright discrimination or exclusion, right? You know, they want to see, you know, everything short of crosses burning on lawns, right? You know, and certainly if your workplace is in this very multicultural province that we live in is populated by people who all look the same, then you have a problem, a problem with your recruitment efforts for one, but that's just a very overt issue, right? Um, you Anti-Black racism in workplaces looks like workplaces with, you know, no Black people, management not realizing it. It also looks like people, you know, people who do diversity work having to constantly make the business case for diversity and inclusion, and management not doing their own work to say, well, what is the cost of having a business where everyone looks the same? What are we losing? What are we losing in terms of our standing in the community? What are we losing in terms of the intellect that we bring to the table? What are we losing in terms of our client base? Right. And it also looks like like businesses that have hundreds of Black people and other racially diverse people, some of the biggest companies in Canada, but those people are segmented in one place and have no real or practical option to advance their careers within the workplace. And so that is what anti-Black racism really looks like in the workplace. It doesn't necessarily look like, you know, lewd emails or the N-word being flown about, or, you know, people, you know, in the you know, manual labor context, you know, people getting into fights on the shop floor. Anti-Black racism and anti-indigeneity is homogeneity at the highest levels of the workplace, and it's management not doing the work. And one thing I would like to say in particular, there's been a lot of discussions and some public incidents that happens every year during Black History Month where somebody will make a very, very public um, mistake in terms of the way they handle Black History Month. And the response is, you need to hire more Black people, you need to have more Black people around the table. All of this is true. I am in no way saying that's not true. But at the end of the day, I think that the one shift, if I can leave anyone with some very important messages, of course you need to hire Black people. Of course you need to hire racialized people and disabled people and people from all communities for their skill and give them equality of opportunity. But the piece that people are missing is, if you are a non-racialized person or a man, and you are in charge, and that doesn't matter what title that comes with that, if you have the power to hire, fire, or otherwise influence the lived experience of people at work, you have to get EDI right. You can't hire your way out of it, right? You should be hiring, right? But it is your responsibility. If your name is on the door, you too have to get EDI right. Because anything else without you doing the work yourself, which includes hiring more racially diverse people, your company isn't really going to make the substantive change that it needs.
I think that is such a great, two key takeaways. One is shifting the question to what are you losing and what is the cost from continuing to have a homogenous workplace that looks just like you, which I think is the language that some people understand in this context, right? What's the cost? But also your responsibility to get EDI right. I think that's a really great message, Charlene. Thank you. Jill and Tema, do you want to jump in on this? What does anti-Black racism look like for you?
Cool. I can jump in. What does anti-Black racism look like for me? You know, the first thing I want to start off by saying, you know, the fact that it took, you know, predominantly non-Black communities, the murder, and thank you, Tema, for calling it what it was, the murder of George Floyd, to wake up. That is anti-Black racism. You know, the fact that all of our allies weren't lined in the streets, you know, when Andrew Loku lost his life, you know, when DeAndre Campbell was taken away, you know, when other Black and racialized people have been murdered, have been killed. That in itself is anti-Black racism. You know, for me, anti-Black racism, there are overt forms. You know, I have heard of the N-word. I have received the N-word in educational settings. I've even received it in communications mailed to my constituency office as an MPP. So make no mistake, there is overt anti-Black racism still, you know, but in some way, shape, or form, those are actually the cases and the circumstances that we can quickly jump onto. You know, we can quickly, you know, get EDI right. We can quickly address. It is the nuanced underbelly of anti-Black racism. It is the racist microaggression. You know, it is the misogynoir, you know, the way in which oftentimes Black women are not only subject to anti-Black racism, but to sexism, you know, because not only must we know our place, quote unquote, and I always tell young girls, never know your place because your place is everywhere, you know? Not only must we know our place as Black folk, but, you know, if you're a woman with a big voice, you know, with a presence, with strong opinions, you're also somehow not doing femininity right either, you know? And that is because, you know, we live in a society that boxes people in, and particularly boxes in marginalized groups, you know, and in the context of this conversation, you know, Black peoples and folks from African diaspora. In my work as a politician, you know, a politician still feeling pretty new, you know, only 2018, you know, when I walked into the legislature, you know, and I see that we are still in a province in the 21st century where we do not have a functional anti-racism directorate, you know, the very institution that is supposed to address anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, anti-Semitism in our province is all but non-existent, you know, to walk in and learn that racial profiling and carding, you know, something that our government today could wake up in the middle of the night and make it go away the next day, or previous governments could. The fact that it's still there is anti-Black racism. You know, the fact that we know that Black youth are still systemically being pushed, like literally shoved into the school to prison pipeline. exponentially being targeted in terms of expulsions and suspensions at a rate that is disproportionately higher than non-Black students. The fact that we have, this pandemic that's among us, and from the get-go, all of us, I'm gonna argue that all of us, Blacks living in Ontario, people who are racialized, folks who have had the shorter end of the class stratification stick, we knew who was going to be disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And look, we were all fortune tellers because we were right. So when I sit in the legislature, or when I stand in the legislature and I'm fighting for things like paid sick days, for instance, or I'm fighting for pay equity, workers' rights to unionize, workers' rights, to get a respectable response from management, or whatever the case might be, this is also me addressing anti-Black racism, because many of those workers, many of those women who are struggling, who are sole parents, who have been worried or faced eviction during this time, are Black community members. So what I like to say is anti-Black racism is everywhere. Any institution, any workplace, any school, any political group that suggests that they are free of racism, free of homophobia, free of any of the isms and the phobias, that is often when they are most living there. That is how I feel. And I really feel like we have to all take responsibility for learning, for doing better, for calling things out. And I'm not saying necessarily that it always has to be an assertive or an aggressive call out. Sometimes it can be a call in, but we have to know that we all play a part in making change for the better, in finding solutions to address anti-Black racism. But it is not the role of Black folks to hold your hand and bring you along, because all too often, Black folks are being asked to bring people along for free. They're being asked to bring people along and wipe away those tears, white tears or otherwise. They're being asked to minimize their trauma and their hurt in order to prop up someone else's ability to feel like a strong ally. It is not the job of the oppressed to teach the oppressor, as Audre Lorde, I believe, said. These are important pieces. So we have to do the work together, but I think the work of anti-Black racism, it requires addressing everyday anti-Black racism. It requires addressing it systemically, and we have to recognize that every institution is entrenched in it, and that was by design. It's not an accident. It is by design that systems of power work on the backs of those that are most marginalized.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, so powerful and such a great reminder about how really anti-Black racism does exist all over. And I think a really useful reminder to people about how it's the overt stuff that is easiest to deal with. It is unpacking these systems and getting people to understand the systemic nature of this problem, and that it does go beyond just the overt acts that are easy to identify, and that's the hardest work. And so that's a really important message. Tema, I want to ask you about this. I'm also conscious that we have only about 15 minutes left. We have one question in the chat that I think would be helpful if you could maybe speak to a bit, Tema, which is clarifying. We've been throwing around the terms EDI without thinking about the fact that we could speak in jargon without realizing we're speaking in jargon. So if you could maybe speak about what that means when we all talk EDI, that would be helpful. And I'm wondering, given that grounding that both Charlene and Jill have given us with respect to anti-Black racism, we were going to move next to two main themes. One is talking about the work each of you are doing to address these systemic barriers, these, moving beyond those overt, clearly intentional acts. What is the work that you're doing to address those systemic barriers, and as well as improve diversity, equity, and inclusion more generally? And also, you mentioned, Jill, allies. We hear a lot of talk about allyship and being a good ally. So I'm also hoping each of you can maybe tell us a little bit about what that means to you. So two more things that we're hoping you can unpack in the remaining 15 minutes. And if we have any time at the end, if people do have questions, you can start putting them into the chat, and I will try and work them into our discussion. I know our amazing panelists actually have places they have to go at 9. So we're going to have to wrap up at 9. They're very busy, but so over to you, Tema.
Sure. So EDI, DEI, various acronyms, REDI, REDI being racial equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, is essentially the entire field of doing that sort of work, generally speaking, within workplaces, within corporations, within communities, at that level. One of the things that I just want to do very quickly, because I think and it'll help sort of frame the work that I do, is the examples of the way anti-Black racism that Charlene and Jill so eloquently talked about are extremely real. However, what I will add is, so often what I observe in Jewish spaces is that Jewish communities will look at those examples and say, yes, but not pay attention to everything that happens in our spaces. It's very, one of the things that I remark very often is it's quite easy for Jewish communities with the values of diversity, anti-racism, justice, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice we shall pursue, tikkun olam, healing the world, will look outward and say, school to prison pipeline, police violence against unarmed Black men, yes, we're going to show up, we're going to be allies, we're going to do this. And in the meantime, a Black person who is Jewish walks into the community and is treated in various different ways. The examples that I hear really frequently is being pressed right away for their life story, because obviously if they're Black, they came to Judaism somehow. Being mistaken for custodial or janitorial staff is very, very frequent. Just being given like side eye about like, what are you doing here? And in more extreme circumstances, unfortunately, being policed. So one of the big conversations that really sprung up after Tree of Life Synagogue, for example, is after that really tragic shooting, synagogues trying to explore how to secure our facilities, and young Black male Jews saying, hey, please don't endanger me to protect the rest of your community. Because you can imagine, if Jews don't imagine that this young Black man is actually Jewish, and then he steps into this space, the risk that that might come with. So all of these structures and systems play themselves out inside our Jewish spaces. And it's broad. I mean, think of how few racially diverse Jewish leaders you have experienced or seen in life. My guess is, if it's anything like my experience, very few. In Canada, that's even more stark. In the US, there is a growing cadre of Jewish leadership who are Jews of color, and who are finally, really in the last few years, being elevated. On the other hand, the URJ biennial in Chicago right before the pandemic, December 2019, a resolution on reparations was passed, and this and that and the other was passed, and a Black woman speaker was told she couldn't pick up her own badge, that the person whose name was on the badge had to come and get it herself. She was assumed to be not her. So we live in these tensions. And I think, so what do? I try and get Jewish communities to, first of all, engage in that outward facing work in ways that are sensitive to some of the concerns around allyship. So one of the things that can happen very often is Jewish communities will say, well, we have this expertise and we're going to show up and help. And we're going to show up and guide, rather than doing the really sort of community engaged practice work that is taking cues from the people impacted. So I advise on that. But most often, I spend my time in Jewish communal spaces talking about the Jews of color who are facing racism in our spaces. I've faced it a lot and will continue to face it because this is slow work. At the same time, really what I'm seeing that's exciting and encouraging is that 10 years behind me, you have, all these like young mixed race Jewish kids and Black Jewish kids. They're not really kids, they're like in their late 20s, but in my mind, they're now kids, which is funny, in rabbinical school. And it's really changing very rapidly. And I think, that is exciting, but at the same time, we need to be extremely, extremely, extremely careful to clean up our own house.
That's great and really helpful. Jill and Charlene, do you have thoughts both with respect to allyship as well as the work that can be done, the work that you are doing to address systemic racism? And I also see two useful questions in the chat if you have thoughts. One is, in addition to educating ourselves on anti-Black racism, practically speaking, what is the best way for white women to support Black and racialized women on a daily basis? And the other, and Charlene, you may have thoughts about this one in particular, what are the best practices for an organization to do to combat racism?
Maybe I will just throw out some quick practical tips in terms of allyship. So educating yourself on anti-Black racism means educating yourself on where you stand and what space you should and should not take up in anti-Black racism. For many people, the most common kind of tensions I see is more listening and less talking. Would always be helpful. And, for some people, it is, at this time, really about financial support, right? Anti-Black racism is linked to people that have been, historically and continue to be economically excluded from society. So whether there is a Black-owned restaurant in your area, buy gift cards, donate to the Black Legal Action Center. There are hundreds of food security programs. Food Share TO is run by a Black queer gentleman. And they're doing transformative work throughout the city because, again, the pandemic is, so there are practical things that you can do. Paul Taylor, thank you. But in terms of organizations, if you don't know where to start, I think the best thing you can do is to hire someone who specializes in that work. The most practical advice I can give to people is, diversity and inclusion strategy with respect to your business or your organization is complex work. There are different types of very equally important but very different types of diversity and inclusion work. There are storytellers, there are people who make speeches and consultants, and then there are business and nonprofit strategists. And so there is a boom in that industry, and rightly so. But the way that you can be most effective is to make sure that the person that you're funneling your resources into someone who is a diversity and inclusion strategist that also has the change management and practical business tools that you need for your organization, whether it's a board or nonprofit, that can help you actually funnel your resources in a way that you are going to get the results that you want. It's not as quick as I wanted it to be. Sorry, Jill, go ahead.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, how do you address anti-Black racism, in one day, in 1 week, in 1 hour? I mean, it's continuous work, and in some ways slow work, and in some ways quick work. What I'd like to say, as MPP, I've been very invested in equity, strategies. I put forth a motion in 2019 calling for an intersectional gender equity strategy. And that was to really ensure that our government looks at every piece of legislation and every motion put forth in the House through an anti-oppressive, anti-racist equity lens to ensure that, people made most marginalized aren't the most negatively impacted by policies that are made by people who do not look like them or have similar lived experience. And on the note of looking like them, we fundamentally need to have, more Black folks in politics. We need to support that, and supporting that, we have to look at the damage of the political system. We have to look at the way the political system has been made to be a white male cisgender heteronormative dream. You know what I mean? And we have to shift that so that it's possible for Black candidates to run regardless of their party. I mean, I'm NDP, yay, but the reality is I just want to see us occupying space in politics so that we can bring our lived experience into the halls of quote unquote power and make the change we want to see. I'm proud to be a member of the Ontario NDP Black Caucus, but what's even more important is that we only had that Black Caucus in this last provincial election. Again, excellent to be part of a first, but way too late, in my opinion. So how do we grow that? We grow that by bringing people on. We grow that by addressing the issues that matter to our community. So for me, that's looking at our small businesses, that's looking at the plight, of communities, vibrant communities like Little Jamaica, that have systemically been broken down, not only by COVID-19, but by gentrification, by the Eglinton Crosstown mess that's impacted many of our communities as well. I think about our strategy that we put forth, calling for an anti-Black strategy across all school boards in Ontario, so that we know top down, down up, that this is being dealt with. It's not a matter of having a fantastic teacher, Mr. Brown, who brings in Until We Are Free, the Black Lives Matter book. It's about having these sorts of books and curriculum and educational opportunities be mandatory. So I stand, alongside, educators like D. Tyler Robinson and organizations like Ontario Black History Society that are calling for mandatory Black education in our schools, not only because it helps Black folks or Black youth, but it helps all youth. Our education is Canadian history, it's Canadian education, so in terms of what, we continue to do, I would like to inspire, I would like to motivate. I saw somebody put up Black Urbanism TO, especially shout out to Black Urbanism TO or Butu, amazing organization. And I want to just keep the dialogue going around anti-Black racism, but more importantly, it's action. It's also about action, because sometimes we get caught in the conversation. And I can tell you, as a Black member, I feel, that our Black communities have been over-consulted, over-researched. We know the truth. We know the truth. The writing is on the wall. We just need to implement. And we need to have government, we need to have politicians that take it seriously and don't only show up on your doorstep, the year of an election, but show up all the time, Thank you.
I know that people have other places to be because our panelists are very busy people. And I feel like that's an amazing note to end on, as much as I would be happy to hear from all of you for another hour, and I'm sure everyone else would too. Jill, I've got to tell you, you say you would like to inspire. All three of you have done exactly that tonight. This has been really inspiring. I think we call this a celebration of amazing Black women leaders, and I think that really has been what it is, what you are in so many ways, people to be celebrated. I think you do set an example and inspire others to follow in your path. I think all of you should be following in Jill's path on this panel and making space for yourself in you're all making space in important places. But I do think we need women like you in positions of power. And so I really thank you for all of that. But I also really thank you for calling out the work that still has to happen and the work that we need to do. And Jill, you put in there, I want to talk about allyship. I would love to hear you about allyship. I don't know if you have 30 seconds left to give on that, or if we should all just hunt you down to get the answers.
I put my email in. I won't be able to do it justice, but
Okay.
I think Charlene actually did it more justice, in knowing how much space to take up and when not to. I think it's very important, and we can learn lessons from the second wave of feminism here. We have to know what type of feminist we are. And there's really only one type of feminist that's going to make moves happen, and that's being an intersectional feminist. That's being someone who doesn't use their space as a woman to take away space from other women. So really, the key is you got to know when to fall back, as the young people say. Be an ally, realize that you may never be thanked, realize that your name may never be on the program guide. Do it for the right reasons. And also don't be an ally behind closed doors, and by that, I mean, when you see racism happening, the worst thing is when you're that Black person alone and you raise your voice and you are so scared, but you're raising your voice because your life depends on it. That's how you feel when you see racism happening and you're wondering, should I say something? Should I not? What'll be the impact? You say something and everyone gets upset, or it's like, oh, there goes Jill again with the big mouth talking about anti-Black racism. You can tell that this comes from experience. And that white woman runs out of the room quietly and comes to you in the hall and says, Jill, wow, that was really good what you said in there. Thanks, but no thanks. What I really need is for you to join me in there where you have something to lose, where you're putting something at stake. You know what I mean? Anyways, that's it.
Jill,
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to join our Holy Blossom family each and every time. It really is.
Well, really thank all of you. That those are some really great takeaways for all of us about the work that we need to do as well, and about making space. And I'm really glad that we could have you all here tonight and center all of your voices on this really important issue and to celebrate the work that you've done. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I hope everyone enjoyed this as much as I know Ruby and I did. And I hope you all have a fantastic evening, and happy Purim.